C-SPAN Now app.
Washington Journal continues.
Joining us at our table this morning is Pete Sepp. He's the president of the National Taxpayers Union, as well as David Cass, who's the executive director of the Americans for Tax Fairness, here to debate tax policy. Let's begin with Republicans' efforts in the House and the Senate to push forward on President Trump's plan to make permanent 2017 tax cuts. I want to show our viewers and the two of you what Steve Scalise, one of the leaders for the Republicans in the House, had to say recently about the tax provisions in the Republican budget bill and why he believes they're important.
You can talk to people in any walk of life in the private sector, in any industry. They will tell you there's trillions, $4-5 trillion of money sitting on the sideline, not being invested in America now until they see what the tax code looks like. Everybody's talking about tariffs right now. Most businesses are waiting to see what the tax code will look like before they make major investments. And they will tell you, if we just prevent a tax hike, which, by the way, every Democrat voted today to raise taxes, and they've said they want the tax rates to go up. We do not. And if we flatline and say no tax increases on American families, that alone will spur trillions of dollars more investment in our economy. And you could see 3% GDP growth, which would be not only great for the economy, more money in your pockets when you go to the grocery store, when you go to the gas station, but it also gives us, the federal treasury, more money coming in to lower the deficit.
Republican Majority Leader in the House, Steve Scalise. David Cass, respond to him.
Well, so the House and Senate Republicans have passed this budget resolution that he's talking about. And what does the bill actually do? So it would cut key programs that workers and families rely on, like Medicaid and SNAP, to the tune of $1.1 trillion and give a big tax cut to those at the top, to billionaires. So the top 1% would actually get a $1.1 trillion tax cut. So it's really shifting money from average Americans to those at the top, and it's deeply concerning.
Pete Sepp?
Well, this bill that they are envisioning is about extending $4 trillion worth of tax relief, preventing a tax increase. We're talking about a $2,000 child tax credit that could go to $1,000 for an average family unless Congress acts. We're talking about maintaining roughly the same level of progressivity prior to the 2017 law as we have now. We're also talking about shaving $2 trillion off an $86 trillion spending plan under current law if the House prevails in its view of how to move forward. There's a whole debate going on right now between the House and the Senate. We call this a budget resolution that they've both agreed on. Well, yes, but they're both taking divergent paths, which calls into question all kinds of policy and political matters going forward.
And then they need to come to a reconciliation. They need to reconcile their differences and put forth a budget reconciliation, which allows them to pass it in the Senate with a simple majority. That is where this debate heads next in Washington. When lawmakers return from this 2-week recess, there will be committee hearings and a lot of debate happening on Capitol Hill to try to solve these differences that you were just talking about. Let me go to the other side of the aisle, because here's Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat senator from Connecticut, on the floor, talking about the Senate debate, during the Senate debate on this House budget bill, their budget bill, explaining why he thinks extending the Trump tax cuts won't benefit the middle and lower class.
Under this new tax cut, if it looks like the old one, and that's the signal that we get, is that households in the top 1% are going to get an average tax cut that's 120 times bigger than the tax cut given to people who are making $90,000 or less. So that's 152 times bigger than the very poor. But let's take somebody who's making $60,000. The richest 1% are going to get a tax cut that is 120 times bigger. How is that fair? Okay, now you'd say, well, that's because they make a lot more money, so of course they're going to get a bigger tax cut. But let's do the math a different way. As a share of after-tax income, the tax cuts at the top are still more than triple the total value of the tax cut received for people with incomes in the bottom 60%. So even when you adjust for the fact that they are making more money, they are still getting a tax cut whose value is 3 times bigger than folks who are making a middle income in this country. And why? I mean, does anybody believe in trickle-down economics anymore? It has been completely discredited.
Pete Sepp, your response to the senator.
Well, we're actually talking about trickle-up tax increases here. So progressive taxation was strong before TCJA. It will remain strong after TCJA,
Explain
the
the
Tax
acronym.
Cuts and Jobs Act. And when you take a look at the top 1% of earners, I'm not sure where the senator got his math from. Okay, they account for roughly 1/5 of all adjusted gross income. They're paying a tax burden of about 40%. In other words, 1.8 times the tax load versus the income load. You look at the bottom end of the scale, roughly 3% of the tax load, roughly 12% of the income load. This is a very progressive system. It was progressive before the 2017 law. It's progressive now. If people want to argue that it should be more so, fine. But everyone from the Congressional Budget Office to the Tax Policy Center on the left will acknowledge this is a highly progressive system. And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did not really change that equation a great deal.
David Cass, is that true?
So I think Senator Murphy is absolutely right. You know, the bill before us, the 2017 bill, the top 1% would get a $61,000 tax cut. If you're in the top 0.1%, you got a $250,000 tax cut. If you're in the bottom 60%, you got $500. So it was highly skewed to the rich. You know, I just don't understand why anyone thinks that billionaires need more tax cuts. That seems like the absolute wrong approach.
We want our viewers to join us in this conversation this morning. Get your thoughts on the Republicans' efforts on tax cuts, as well as their spending proposals and spending cuts. Here's how you can join the conversation. If you are a Republican, dial in at 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. Remember, you can text if you don't want to call at 202-748-8003. Just include your first name, city, and state. Let me share this reporting with the both of you and get your response to it. White House is quietly discussing a plan with House Republicans that could give people making $1 million or more a 40% tax rate, sources tell Fox News. Talks very preliminary, and it's one of several options floated for reconciliation. Bloomberg first reported these plan details. Pete Sepp, your initial, what would that mean, 40%?
Well, it sure seems like an orphan proposal from the start. Majority Leader Scalise is denying it. Speaker Johnson is denying it. Most conservatives in the House, where the votes are really going to count, are denying that they'd ever vote for it. So I'm not sure.
Where would it come from then?
Well, these are called trial balloons here in Washington, D.C., and I don't think it's a serious one. Now, if we want to have a discussion about tax breaks that favor the wealthy, well, one of them is the state and local tax deduction. With the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act limited to $10,000, the amount you could deduct. There are those on the Democratic and Republican sides of the aisle who want to blow that cap away entirely or lift it to some higher level. Well, that benefits primarily the wealthy. If you were to double the cap, for example, that would be a huge revenue impact going mostly to people making $100,000 or more. You know, those are discussions to have about fairness in the tax code rather than jacking up rates or discussing a proposal that just seems dead on arrival.
David Cass, what do you think?
I mean, look, why is the White House talking about this? It's because they're feeling the heat. The public does not want more tax cuts for the very wealthy. And this is a way to try to respond. But just to step back for a second, I mean, the top tax rate on the wealthy was 39.6 before the 2017 bill. So this is no radical step. We would be thrilled if we did this. I am very skeptical, ultimately, that Republicans will realize that they really need to do something to tax the wealthy.
Before we get to calls, I want to share with you and our viewers of the opinion pages of the Washington Post this morning. Senator Josh Hawley writes this: a working class tax cut is needed and possible. He writes this, that Republicans can begin to repair the way that working class and lower class Americans are feeling. They can give America's working people a lifeline by giving them the biggest working class tax cut in our history. Here's how. Make the largest income tax credits, the home mortgage deduction, the child tax credit, and the charitable deduction available to all Americans who pay the payroll tax. Pete Sepp?
It's a good start. I think that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which doubled the standard deduction, was not only an important step for middle-class tax relief, it was an important step for tax simplification. Maybe that's a way to square the circle here. Maybe, since the law doubled the standard deduction and suddenly, instead of 60% using that deduction, you have 90% of filers using it, maybe you increase it even further. That could also address some of the equity concerns over wages and tips, which the president, I should say overtime wages and tips, which the president now wants some kind of tax relief for. That could create unfairness in the system laterally. What if you don't get overtime or you don't get tips, but you still have a pretty low wage? You still need the tax relief. Making the standard deduction bigger is one way of addressing that.
So what do you think, David Cass? Do you agree with this Republican senator here?
Well, I think the underlying thing is we have to look at the 2017 bill. And just remember, it was an expensive failure. So what did they promise at the time when they passed it? They said that it would pay for itself. Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan CBO, said, look, it cost almost $2 trillion. They said it was going to increase wages by $5,000. That didn't happen. The best analysis found that corporate executives, highly paid ones, they did well. Anybody under $115,000 got nothing. I think it's a great conversation to have about increasing tax credits for working families. We should increase the child tax credit. Democrats did it a few years ago, and it cut child poverty almost in half. That's the right approach, rather than giving more tax cuts for billionaires.
So what's on the table right now? When you look at Senator Hawley's proposal here, is any of it included in the House or the Senate bill?
Oh, certainly. I mean, the increased child tax credit, which doubled in 2017, still on the table. There are discussions right now led by my organization on how you move forward with preserving the child tax credit and maybe making some changes that would allow it to be more generous while still being fiscally responsible. We've got to index the amount of the credit itself for inflation. Right now, it's only the income thresholds for eligibility. They're very complex changes, but the end result needs to be that we strengthen the child tax credit so families have tax relief, at the same time allowing businesses the certainty they need to invest and grow the economy. And there's a whole stack of studies which, we could get into a game of my economists can beat up your economists, but there's plenty of research to suggest that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did have a positive impact on a lot of business investment and family well-being.
All right, well, let's see what our viewers have to say on this. They've heard the arguments from the two of you, so let's turn to them. John in Virginia, Democratic caller. John, what do you say?
Good morning, Chris. Thank you for taking my call. I think that you have to understand one thing. People need to realize the lawmakers, they signed a contract a long time ago that Governor, whatever his name was, not to increase the tax no matter what they do. That law is still there. The lawmakers cannot talk about reduce the tax because they will lose their seat. Republicans, they know that, and they cannot do nothing about it. The reality is all these millionaires, they know that the law goes their way, and they get the benefit out of this. 7 out of millionaires, when they ask, what are you going to do with the money if you get a tax cut? 2 of them say that we're going to invest the community. 5 of them, they say they don't know what to do with it. And it's a shame that Uber drivers who get the tips, they have to pay taxes out of that. waitress, they have to pay taxes. It's a shame that if we want our country to go better, we have to reinvest our community and our streets, our schools, our police officers. This is not something you have to be genius. The middlemen have to be out of our life and let invest our community.
All right, so John, let's take your point about investments. Pete Sepp, I want you to respond to him and his citation of those wealthy CEOs saying that, or wealthy individuals saying what they're going to do with the money if they get a tax cut.
Well, there is a lot of economic evidence to suggest that investment has increased since the 2017 law. Here's the National Bureau of Economic Research based near Harvard. Companies were impacted by lower taxes, increased their investment by 20% in the first 2 years of the law. Here's Duke University, a study showing it increased GDP and total wages paid to employees by 2.2 and 3.4% respectively, and on and on and on. Look, it's very clear taxes do have an impact on businesses and individuals' decisions. Otherwise, we'd be talking about the weather here.
David Cass?
I mean, look, the centerpiece of this 2017 bill was they reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. More than $1 trillion basically was given to corporations. What did they do with that money? The biggest thing they did with that was to buy back their own stock and to give out dividends, which overwhelmingly benefits the wealthy. The top 10% owns 93% of all corporate stocks. So rather than investing in workers and increasing salaries, that's what corporations did. So we need to raise the corporate rate back up to make sure that they're paying their fair share.
So Pete, respond to that, because we've heard that, and for our viewers who've heard this discussion, these corporations did stock buyback. Was that a bad or a good thing? Not
necessarily a bad thing. Companies do stock buybacks when they want to strategically reposition their cash, and of course, that can help to raise stock values, and with more than 50% of American households invested in the market somehow, that can benefit them. Now, as for corporations paying their fair share, well, you got to look at the history of how taxes have changed on businesses. Pass-through businesses, S-corps, sole proprietorships, self-employed individuals, those types of establishments have increased dramatically since the 1960s. If you include their income and the taxes they pay alongside the taxes that corporations pay, the business contribution to the revenue stream is about 3% of GDP, almost exactly where it was in the 1960s when business structures were mostly corporations. It's the evolution of the economy.
All right. Well, let me go to Sean, who's in Florida, independent. Sean, you're next in this conversation.
Grand risings to y'all. I actually have two things. One, me being a single male with adult kids, none of what you all are talking about has any kind of positive effect on me. Number two, you talk about fair share. The top, I would say maybe 10 to 15% of the earners in this country control 80% of all the money in the United States. So if they control 80% of all the funds in the United States, why are they not paying 80% of the taxes? That would be fair.
All right,
so
Sean.
The fact that
I'll have David Katz respond to you.
I think the caller has a great point. Look, let's look at Billionaires, for example. In 2017, Billionaires had $3 trillion worth of wealth. Now it has more than doubled to $6.5 trillion. Do we really think that billionaires need more money? As opposed to they should be paying their fair share, which is why President Biden has proposed in the past, and Senator Ron Wyden, the top Democrat in the Senate Finance Committee, a billionaire minimum income tax. So just like, your average worker has to pay taxes on their income every year, that billionaires should have to pay on their gains as well. So that would, I think, make a much more fair tax system. All
right, Joe in New Jersey, Republican, welcome.
Thank you. By the way, there's only 902 billionaires in the whole country out of 330 million people. So let's throw that one out. That's crazy. If you took all their money, you wouldn't be able to run the government for a few months. The top 1% of taxpayers pay 40.43% of the taxes. It goes down to The top 5% pay another 21%. The top 5 to 10 pay another 11%. And go on and so on and so on. The bottom 50% pay less than 3% of the taxes. So all of this stuff is baloney. Here's the one thing I want to ask Mr. Koss, the Democrat there. How much? Now, I only graduated high school. I've done very well in life. My father would say, the harder you work, the luckier you get. And it's true. I worked hard. I've done very well. How much of my hard-earned money, Mr. Koss, are you entitled to? Please answer that question.
Why do you say...
How much of my hard-earned money are you entitled to?
What do you mean? Why him? What do you mean you entitled to? Like the government? Are you saying the government?
And he's fighting for more taxes for people.
Okay. Understood. All right.
So I'm not entitled to anything, but in terms of the government, look, anybody who is a multimillionaire, a billionaire, I don't think they're paying their fair share. And I think this is often what happens is that the conservative side will say, well, what you mean is to raise taxes on everybody. That's not what we're saying. We just want big corporations and billionaires to pay their fair share. That's really so I don't know what the caller's income is, but if he's a billionaire, then he should pay more.
Well, what about his math, though, about, how the percentage of taxes being paid by wealthy versus the percentage of tax being paid by lower income, well, zero, according to him, by lower income Americans?
Well, look, first off, the very wealthy have so much of the income pie. It's not surprising that they're paying a fair amount of taxes. But the other thing is you have to actually include payroll taxes, too. When you include federal income taxes and payroll taxes hit average workers very, very hard. So the total amount of taxes that are being paid, and if you include state and local taxes, it actually hits workers very hard.
Sepp, you're shaking your head. You agree?
It certainly can hit workers very hard, but even after accounting for those, Congressional Budget Office has done studies by income quintile, by top 1%, by top 0.1%. The effective rates go from negative at the bottom end of the scale because of the earned income credit offsetting both income and payroll taxes, all the way up to 35% for the people at the very top. Are there billionaires who might be using tax loopholes creatively? Yeah, sure. That doesn't necessarily mean that the income distribution and the tax distribution are terribly skewed. This remains an incredibly progressive system with very high compliance rates. We should be proud of the fact that we have so many Americans paying in, even billionaires. And we have to look at our tax system as one that is hardly broken. It needs fixing, it needs repairs, but it hasn't been utterly destroyed by the 2017 law. It's been made stronger.
All right.
Go
ahead, yes.
So, look, 55 corporations, huge corporations, pay zero in taxes. Tesla, for many years, pays zero in taxes. It is a system that those at the top, we really have two tax systems. If you're a plumber, if you're a nurse, you pay taxes every 2 weeks. If you're a billionaire, you may never pay taxes on your gains. If you get all the stock and you don't sell it, you may never, ever be taxed on it. That doesn't make any sense. We should have one tax system that treats everybody the same, and the very wealthy need to pay their fair share.
The tax system treats families when they realize their capital gains, and they are subject to rates of up to 24%, but only when the gains are realized. If we want to treat everybody the same, that should apply to everyone regardless of their income.
In what way?
Well, Joe Biden's proposals were to tax unrealized gains on certain investments on an annual basis, but only for the wealthy. Well, families don't have to do that. They don't have to sit there and say, well, the painting my grandma gave me hanging on a wall, I have to pay a tax every year on it. That's not quite how some of these mark-to-market proposals, as they're called, work. But the point is, if we want equality in the tax system, we want equal treatment, you tax a gain when it is realized, when you sell the asset, not simply because you're holding on to it year after year. I mean, that's just the way the principle has been in tax systems for quite a number of years, centuries, indeed.
Well, what about leveraging your stock equity by borrowing against it and then taking that money and doing,
sure.
I mean, so
those
it doesn't get
those
taxed.
are more important questions.
So
and
what do you
Tax
do?
Cuts and Jobs Act, for example, actually limited some of those practices, some of the shuffling around of cash and how you could take interest limitations or what you could include. This long acronym called EBITDA is a real...
Sounds awful.
Yes, and there are even worse ones in the tax system. You know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was not just an exercise of, let's see how we can give the most to the rich and the least to the poor. There were honest efforts to try and flatten out some of the most unfair elements in international taxation or how companies were treated across the tax system. You know, we talk about fairness as an issue of looking up and down the income scale. What about across the income scale? Are people with the same income paying roughly the same amount of tax? TCJA helped to address that, but we're a long way from that kind of equity and fairness.
All right, David Katz, add to this.
Yeah, so, I mean, look, billionaire wealth has been skyrocketing. And I think the impact on our society is really corrosive. It's very undemocratic. We just did a study of the 2024 election and found that 100 billionaire families contributed $2.6 billion to fund the elections. $1 out of $6 in our total campaigns came from billionaires. You know, that's not democratic. I mean, when you see one person like Elon Musk contributing $270 million to try to win an election, that's not one person, one voice. And I think we need to get at the source of, so that we don't have these dynasties, these billionaire dynasties of people who are able to really buy their own views.
All right. I want to add to the conversation this reporting by Punchbowl News this morning. The red lines begin. As we told you, House Republicans, Senate Republicans, they have to come together on their two budget proposals or their differences within their party and come up with a budget reconciliation that can be passed with a simple majority in the Senate. In other words, Republican votes only. And this is Punchbowl News. The red lines begin. A dozen House Republicans say no to big Medicaid cuts. David Cass, your reaction to that reporting this morning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I think, again, the Republicans are feeling the heat that Americans don't want $880 billion in cuts to the Medicaid program. I mean, what is Medicaid? Medicaid is, it helps seniors to afford nursing homes. It helps disabled people to get health care. It is 1 in 4 births in this country. People don't want health care ripped from Americans. And, you know, this idea that that Republicans are just cutting waste or fraud or abuse, you cannot cut that much from this program without taking away health insurance from Americans.
All right, Pete Sepp, so if you don't have Medicaid cuts, then how do you pay for these extending the tax cuts?
First, we're not looking at Medicaid cuts. We're looking at slowdowns in the rate of increase in spending. Even the Bipartisan Policy Center pointed out recently, for example, there's the Medicaid provider tax scam where states will raise that tax on willing providers in order to get more money from Washington into the system. It's been a scam that Barack Obama himself proposed to end and phase out in his own budget way back in 2013. Well, if you do reforms like that, you're going to achieve Medicaid savings over the long term that are not going to take away people's health care or insurance. It's going to make the system fairer. Now, paying for it, yeah, I'm one of the folks who says tax cuts don't necessarily just magically pay for themselves. We have to pay attention to the federal deficit. In either budget resolution that you want to look at, the Senate's version or the House version, they envision an increase in the national debt of between $5 and $6 trillion on top of 35 plus. We can't afford that. And we have come up with, along with left-wing organizations, ideas for reducing or controlling the growth of federal spending. With U.S. PIRG, a left-leaning group, we've identified $800 billion in budget savings just this morning as part of the Pentagon budget campaign, a broad-based coalition that we're a part of. We're calling on President Trump to start looking at foreign military bases and whether we have too big of a footprint abroad. That could be a huge savings in military spending. We need to take a look at every area of the federal budget, not just from the DOGE perspective of waste, fraud, and abuse, but prioritization of spending, because we haven't seen anything yet with the deficit situation with Social Security and Medicare on the line in the future. They are in bad shape financially, and tax increases are going to be swamped by the spending increases in those programs unless we get them under control.
All right, let's go to Marion in Athens, Georgia. Democratic caller, thanks for waiting. Your turn.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. And you were just right where I wanted to go. We keep talking and arguing about tax cuts and about cuts or tax to the rich and taking away Medicaid. But listen, the problem is the debt and the money that we have to pay, the interest that we have to pay on the debt. The bottom line is, until we do something about the debt, none of this is going to go away. My suggestion would be to have a national sales tax on everything but food and medicine of maybe 1% or 0.5%. To every time you buy something, everybody is paying a little bit on the debt, and that's, we would call it a deficit tax. Okay.
All right. Marion, let's take your idea, David Cass.
Well, look, there's a very simple way to reduce the cost of this bill. It would be to say everybody who makes under $400,000 a year, we would continue it, but everybody over 400 would get nothing. Why are Republicans, as Pete said, look, in the bill itself, they're going to increase the national debt limit by $4 or $5 trillion because they're not paying for it. They're cutting programs that workers and families rely on to give tax cuts to the wealthy, and they're increasing the debt. It's like the worst of all possible worlds.
We're also not paying for all of the spending increases. That's the primary driver of our national debt in the future. Suppose we decide to go the route of preserving all the tax relief under $400,000 for those households, and we decide to, double the tax rates for those making over $400,000. You might, if you're lucky, raise $1 trillion out of that. Federal government is going to spend 80 times, 100 times that much over the same period of time that you would realize that revenue. You could let all of the tax cuts expire, and as a percent of the economy, revenues would shoot up from about 17%, as the way they are now, of GDP, to maybe 20%. Federal spending would go from 22 to 26% over the same period of time. If we don't attack the structural problems, which is interest on the national debt, the mistakes we made borrowing under Republican and Democratic administrations, and the entitlement programs, not only Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, but other benefit programs that people are counting on, they aren't going to be around. Social Security faces a 21% reduction in benefits when the trust fund goes belly up about 10 years from now. Time is running out for people to get courage in this town and think about how they address those problems.
So may I?
Sure.
So I think this is my favorite statistic. So the increase of the debt since 2000, 57% of it is due to the Trump tax cuts and the Bush tax cuts. So the majority of the increase in the debt is due to these tax cuts, which mostly benefited the wealthy. And if you take out the spending for COVID, which was one time, and if you take out the spending in 08, 09 for the Great Recession, 90% of the increase in the debt is due to these tax cuts.
Well, David Cass, the Washington Post editorial board says you can't take that money out of the equation. The money that Congress and the presidents at the time injected into the economy. And they say because of that and the situation we're in, America's ill-positioned for a recession. And this is what they argue. Until the financial crisis that began in 2008, U.S. government debt generally amounted to less than half of America's gross domestic product. That sole exception was World War II, when borrowing briefly drove the debt to 106% of GDP. As soon as the war ended, however, fiscally responsible legislators raced to bring down the debt to a sustainable level, and by 1956, it was once again back in the safe zone. The response to the global financial crisis 2008 dramatically altered this math. By the time President Barack Obama left office, the national debt was hovering around 75% of GDP. It expanded still further during the pandemic, approaching 100% of GDP in 2020. Like the World War II debt, most of this was incurred because the government was responding to an extraordinary emergency and borrowing as needed to fund many stimulus measures. After the emergency ended, though, policymakers made no effort to pay down the debt. The Biden administration and its congressional enablers chose instead to worsen the situation, running bigger and bigger deficits even as the economy recovered. 5.3% in 2022, 6.1% in 2023, 6.3% in 2024.
So I think that's absolutely right. And there are very clear ways that we could raise revenue to be able to pay down the debt. So this idea that we only can cut spending, look, if we raise the corporate tax rate to just to 28%, that would be more than $1 trillion. If we raise the top income rate on those over $700,000, that would raise $600 billion. If we did this billionaire minimum income tax, that would be $500 billion. You know, there are things that if we ask the wealth, the billionaires and big corporations to pay their fair share, we would raise revenue and be able to decrease the debt.
Pete Sepp, before you respond, the Washington Post editorial, what can be said with confidence is that the United States is ill-positioned to weather another economic storm because of the feckless policy decisions that have been made during the past decades.
Yeah,
there's no room to go.
It's called a lack of fiscal capacity. And here's the problem. If we were, again, to let the tax cuts all expire, to contemplate a $4 trillion tax increase, sure, revenues would grow by 4 or 5% a year easily. The benefit programs are going to grow between 6 and 7% a year. They will be chasing that figure forever. And we have to make structural improvements to these benefit programs. Otherwise, nobody's going to have the benefits that they can count on. We need to realize, too, that there are other revenue-raising solutions besides punitive tax hikes that might reduce investment. We should be looking at spectrum auctions. The federal government owns a lot of airwaves. Those auctions have yielded hundreds of billions in revenues in the past. We should be looking at whether we're getting a fair return when there's oil and gas exploration or grazing on public lands. Those kinds of things can bring in revenues to the federal government, as well as working on the spending reductions. That would give us, I think, a path to return to fiscal sanity. We can't balance the budget in any reasonable amount of time, but I think Treasury Secretary Bessent's goal of bringing the deficit back down toward 3% of the economy, GDP, every year is a reasonable one. We're above 5 right now.
All right, David Cass, I'm going to give you Jim in Lafayette, Indiana, a Republican who's joining us there. Hi, Jim.
Hi. I have a question and I guess kind of a comment for Mr. Cass, and the other gentleman can add in. But basically, the Democrats, you know, it's always tax the rich, tax the billionaires, tax the millionaires, tax the corporations. You know, my question / comment is, how does taxing corporations and rich people more going to improve the lives of everyday Americans? You know, just giving more and more, taking money from Americans, giving it to the federal government. The more money the government gets, they're not going to improve the lives of everyday Americans. I mean, that's what I think.
All right. Well, let's take your point, Jim. David Cass.
Look, it's a great question. Whatever our size of government, the question to me is, who should fund it? Is it just that we should tax working families, or do rich people need to pay their fair share? And so if we're paying for national defense, if we're paying for health care, if we're paying for education, whatever the size of that government is, I think my point is that the rich need to pay their fair share to fund it.
Ashburn, Virginia. Sarah's a Democratic caller. Hi, Sarah.
Hi. My question has to do with the distribution that the billionaires and millionaires have a way of investing their money, and they never have to pay taxes on it. The people who have invested in a 401k, when they turn 72 and a half, then that distribution has to come out. And it's at a higher tax rate, especially for people making about $150,000 or below. So my taxes have gone up a lot due to the distribution because my income has gone up. And I would think that should be a way to reform that distribution tax, especially for people who have invested all these years for their retirement, and all you see it to go for more and more taxes.
All right, Sarah. Pete Sepp.
Yeah, legislation called the Secure 2.0 Act, which passed a few years ago, tried to address that RMD, required minimum distribution problem, and the taxes that were attended to it. They've still got a way to go to help smooth that out. And again, with an increased number of people saving and investing, which is a fantastic thing, over half of American households doing that with the stock market, it's vitally important that we not penalize that at the same time that Social Security has problems and pension systems outside of Social Security are weak. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, a quasi-federal agency that's supposed to back up pensions, has traditionally had undercapitalization problems. And so we could wind up with a situation where there's a meltdown in federal finances, corporate pensions. People need those nest eggs, and they need to be able to accumulate them without getting punished by the tax system.
We'll go to Dick, who's in Sharpsburg, Georgia, Republican. Welcome to the conversation.
Good morning, gentlemen. When Trump was in his first term, he was standing on a stage somewhere. They were accusing him of not paying his taxes or his fair share or whatever. And he was standing on a stage, and behind him on a table was the federal tax code, 86,000 pages. And he said, you, Congress, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says only Congress will lay and collect taxes to pay the debt. Not the IRS, not the Federal Reserve, not the Senate, not the President, only Congress. Now, you know perfectly well, there's no way in the world that Congress write 86,000 pages of federal tax code. Trump at the time, I think he cut that almost in half, which was way, way, way too much. And I would imagine both of you men carry a copy of Neil Bortz's book, The Fair Tax, around with you as if it was your Bible, because a federal sales tax only will solve every problem in this country, but boy, it will make all of our elected officials so accountable.
Okay, Dick, let's take what you had to say there. David Kath.
Well, look, I think we do know that President Trump, there were several years where he paid zero in taxes. As a billionaire, we all have to pay taxes. Everyday Americans have to pay taxes. Why is there a separate system, essentially, where you can hire fancy accountants and lawyers and use all these loopholes to pay zero in taxes? And that's why we really need a better tax system that makes sure that the wealthy pay their fair share.
What about his proposal?
Well, I think that the problem with a flat tax is that it really hits very hard to working families. It would have to increase their taxes, and it would lower taxes on the very wealthy. So that's really the problem with it.
Pizza.
The question is how we get there. Now, my organization tracks complexity in the tax code, and the caller's right. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act roughly reduced the amount of hours we spend every year on complying with the federal tax system by from 8 billion hours to 7 billion hours. That's still a huge sum when you consider the time value, the actual money that you give up spending that time, and the out-of-pocket costs. It's about $460 billion a year, 20 cents on every income tax dollar collected. We do have to simplify the system. How do we get there? Well, there was an effort about 15 years ago, led by Senator Ron Wyden, called Cleanse the Code. A number of organizations, Citizens for Tax Justice, Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, partners of yours, Dave, and on the conservative side, American Conservative Union, NTU, and others, we united around 3 principles: simplification, the opportunity for all Americans to get ahead, and fiscal responsibility. 3 principles to guide tax reform going forward. Let's do it.
Well, who fought it?
A lot of interests who, both rich and middle class, and politicians who claim to represent both, who like the status quo. You know, all these credits and deductions exist for a number of reasons, but a big one is so elected officials can take credit for having provided them. When they get a little less selfish and realize that we all benefit from a transparent system with a broad base, low simple rates, I think we're going to get somewhere.
David Cass, would you agree?
I would totally agree with that. You know, I think there are aspects of it. It's the Lawyer and Accountant Full Employment Act, right? It creates lots and lots of hours and, you know, absolutely simplification. But I think the way we do simplification is to make sure, I mean, let's take, for example, the estate tax. You know, right now, if you have $28 million as a couple, you can pass that on tax-free. And there's some of the Republicans are talking about eliminating that. Well, you know, how rich do you have to be able to pass on $28 million tax-free? You know, we should be making sure that we're strengthening the estate tax. 99% of Americans do not pay the estate tax, absolutely, because they don't, you know, you have to be incredibly wealthy. Almost no family farms are impacted. Only 50 farms in the whole country each year pay any estate tax, so we should be strengthening the estate tax.
All right, well, I'm going to get final thoughts from both of you here about what you're watching for when House and Senate return next week and Republicans start to negotiate with themselves. David Cass.
Well, I think one of the things that's been a big controversy is this current policy thing, right? So the Senate Republicans are saying, magic math. We can extend these tax cuts and we don't have to pay for it. And what they're arguing is because we're doing it now, if we do it in the future, it doesn't cost money. It's a little bit like saying, well, I'm paying Netflix each month, and moving forward, I don't have to pay for it because I'm discontinuing it. So that is just this magic math, which is terrible, and we'll see how that plays out. You know, they should pay for, you know, tax cuts need to be paid for. And I think the other big thing will be what happens with these big cuts. You know, do some of the Republican moderates really stand up and say, we don't want Medicaid cuts, we don't want SNAP cuts, we're not going to vote for it?
Pizza?
I happen to agree that is a fraught with risk strategy in the Senate side. We need to think about the deficit impact of tax and spending policies going forward. If we want to look at unfair tax subsidies, we're looking at SALT. We're looking at the electric vehicle subsidies, many others that tend to skew toward the wealthy. We need to look at spending restraint. No one in Congress right now is talking about actually cutting spending. They're just trying to pull it back. The House's vision of $2 trillion in spending restraint has to be the starting point, not the end point. Both parties have to face up to the biggest drivers of the debt and the mismanagement of the debt, which is costing us trillions in interest over the future. We've got to address those problems along with maintaining pro-growth tax relief.
All right. You can find more out about Pete Seth and his group, the National Taxpayers Union, by going to ntu.org. And for more from David Cass and his group, he's the executive director of the Americans for Tax Fairness. Go to americansfortaxfairness.org. Thank you both for the conversation this morning.
My
Appreciate
pleasure.
it. Thanks for
Thank you
talking
so
to our
much.
viewers. We'll take a break. Coming up on the Washington Journal, former CIA Russia analyst George Beebe will discuss the state of negotiations to end the conflict between Russia in Ukraine. But first, after this break, open forum. A lot of news to share with you, and we can get your reaction to any public policy or political debate. There are the lines on your screen. Start dialing in.
High school